On a frozen morning in December 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the edge of a frozen river in Russia, watching his army die. 6 months earlier, he'd invaded with 600,000 men, the largest army Europe had ever seen. Now, fewer than 100,000 stumbled through the snow, frostbitten, starving, pursued by Cossacks. His generals begged him to negotiate, to accept that Russia was lost. Napoleon refused. Impossible is not a French word, he'd once said. But standing there in the Russian winter, watching his dreams freeze to death, he learned something terrible. Impossible isn't a word, it's a fact, and obsession doesn't care about facts. This is the story of a man who conquered most of Europe and destroyed everything because he could never stop. The boy from nowhere. Napoleon wasn't supposed to be anyone. Born on Corsica, a backwater island recently sold to France, he grew up speaking Italian, with a thick accent that marked him as foreign. At military school, the other boys mocked him. Poor, short, Corsican, an outsider with nothing but ambition. He read obsessively. Military history, philosophy, mathematics. Knowledge was power, and power was the only thing that mattered. When the French Revolution erupted, the old aristocratic order collapsed. Suddenly, talent mattered more than birth. Napoleon seized the moment. At 24, he devised an artillery strategy that saved Toulon. At 27, he was given command of the Army of Italy, a ragged force that hadn't been paid in months. Within a year, he'd conquered northern Italy and defeated 5 Austrian armies. He was 28 years old, and he was just getting started. The engine of obsession. What drove Napoleon? Beneath the ambition, something deeper, the need to prove he belonged. Napoleon never forgot being the Corsican outsider, the boy with the accent, the nobody from nowhere. Every victory was proof that he mattered. Every conquest was evidence that he deserved to be there. But proof is never enough when you're trying to convince yourself. He conquered Italy, Egypt, Austria, Prussia. He redrew the map of Europe. In 1804, he crowned himself Emperor of France. He took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. Napoleon answered to no one. But here's the thing about obsession. It doesn't stop when you win. It demands more. The Russian winter. By 1810, Napoleon controlled most of Europe. Only Britain remained defiant. So, Napoleon created the continental system, forbidding all European nations from trading with Britain. Russia refused to cooperate. Napoleon saw this as betrayal. His advisors urged caution. Russia was vast. Its winter was legendary. Invading made no strategic sense, but Napoleon wasn't thinking strategically. If Russia defied him and got away with it, his empire would crack, his invincibility would shatter. So in June 1812, he invaded with 600,000 men. The Russians didn't fight. They retreated, burning everything behind them. Napoleon marched forward, winning battles but gaining nothing. No supplies, no surrender, just emptiness. By September, when he reached Moscow, his army had lost a third of its men. Moscow was empty. Then the Russians burned it. Napoleon waited 5 weeks, expecting Tsar Alexander to negotiate. The Tsar sent no message. Finally, in October, with winter closing in, Napoleon retreated. The nightmare began. Snow fell early that year. Temperatures dropped to -30. Men froze to death in their sleep. Horses collapsed and were eaten. Cossacks picked off stragglers. By the time they crossed back into Poland, fewer than 100,000 survived. Napoleon had lost 500,000 men. For nothing. The inability to stop. After Russia, Napoleon's enemies formed a coalition. Napoleon fought brilliantly in 1813 and 1814, but he was outnumbered. France was exhausted. His allies urged him to negotiate, to accept reasonable terms, to keep his throne, but Napoleon couldn't accept reasonable. He couldn't step back. couldn't accept a smaller role, couldn't stop being Napoleon, because stopping would mean admitting that Russia had broken him, that the boy from Corsica didn't deserve to be emperor after all. So he fought on, until there was nothing left. In April 1814, his own marshals forced him to abdicate. Napoleon was exiled to Elba, a tiny island off the coast of Italy. He was 44. 10 years earlier, he'd ruled Europe. The 100 Days. Napoleon lasted 10 months on Elba, 10 months of boredom, 10 months of knowing that he was supposed to be something more. In March 1815, he escaped. He landed in France with 1,000 men. The king sent an army to arrest him. When that army saw Napoleon, they defected. Soldiers cried. Within 3 weeks, Napoleon was back in Paris, without firing a shot. Europe panicked. They would crush him this time. On June 18, 1815, he faced Wellington at Waterloo. For most of the day, Napoleon almost won. Then Prussian reinforcements arrived. His army broke. 4 days later, he abdicated again. This time, the British shipped him to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, one of the most isolated places on Earth. Napoleon spent the last 6 years of his life there, dictating his memoirs, arguing with his captors about how history would remember him. He died in 1821, at age 51. What obsession costs. Napoleon conquered Europe, but Europe conquered him back. If he'd negotiated after Russia, he could have kept France, could have remained emperor, could have died in Paris, not on a prison island, but that would mean admitting he could fail, admitting he was human, so he kept fighting, even when he knew he'd lost. This is what obsession does. It doesn't let you quit, even when quitting is the only rational choice. Napoleon once said, "Glory is fleeting, but obscurity is forever." He spent his entire life chasing glory, terrified of being forgotten, terrified of returning to the obscurity he'd clawed his way out of. And in the end, he got both: glory and a prison cell on the edge of the world. The mirror he holds up. We look at Napoleon and think, I would never be that obsessed. I would know when to quit, but would we? How many people destroy their health chasing success? How many sacrifice relationships for careers? How many keep pushing long past the point where it makes sense because stopping feels like failure? Napoleon is an extreme case, but the psychology isn't. The need to prove ourselves, the fear of obscurity, the belief that if we stop striving, we'll lose everything we've built. These are universal. Napoleon just had more power to act on them. And power doesn't change the psychology, it amplifies it. The final question. On St. Helena, looking out at the endless ocean, did Napoleon finally understand? Did he realize that all the conquests, all the crowns, all the victories meant nothing if you lost yourself in the pursuit? We'll never know. But history knows. Napoleon conquered Europe and died alone on a rock. He proved he was the greatest general of his age. But he couldn't prove what he really wanted to prove, that he was enough, just as he was, without the crown, without the conquests, without the obsession. Because obsession never proves what you want it to prove. It only demands more, until there's nothing left. Napoleon's final words reportedly were, France, army, head of the army, Josephine. Even at the end, he was still fighting, still commanding, still trapped in the role he'd created. The boy from Corsica who became emperor of Europe and died a prisoner, not of his enemies, but of his own obsession. The question isn't whether Napoleon could have stopped. The question is, can any of us recognize when the fire we're carrying has started to consume us, before it's too late? Before we win the world and lose ourselves? Napoleon couldn't. Can we?